Okay, so the next thing we're going to work on is talking about loading the saw frame with the saw blade. So saw blades come in all different sizes. What we're working with is a 3/0 or a 3/0 saw blade. So it's like about a middle size saw blade. It's tiny enough to get small detail, but large enough to cut through large portions of the metal. So the higher up in numbers that you go in aught, like 3/0, 4/0, 5/0, the higher that goes, the smaller the blade gets, the lower it goes, and then moving into whole numbers like 2/0, 1/0, 1, 2, 3, 4, the bigger the blade gets. And the less detail you'll get, but the more it will chomp away at the metal. So when you go to undo the saw blades, at first, this is all going to be tightly wound in a piece of wire. You want to just unravel the very top or pull that little nub off. Sometimes it's hard to get that top part of the wire off. Just unravel a little bit. You want to about a quarter of the way. You want to leave these all wrapped together, but you do have to unravel it a little bit just to get a saw blade out. And then you want to try and pull one of these saw blades out. You don't want to yank it out because you don't want to pull that tooth back on the saw blade. So find the lucky winner that wants to come loose from there and pull that one out. As you start pulling the blades out one after the next, it becomes easier. So once we have our blade out of the bundle, we want to put it in our hand, in our left hand. And I suggest this even for left-handed people. You should have the blade always in your left hand because the thumb screws are on the right, and it's just easier to, unless you have a saw frame that the thumb screws are on the left, the thumb screws are almost always on the right. So you really want to just be able to tighten it with your right hand instead of reaching over here with your left hand. So we have the saw blade in our left hand, the saw frame in your bench pin. So have the top of the saw frame resting in the middle of the V on your bench pin, and then put the handle, just rest the handle against your collarbone or wherever it lays, like depending on the height that you're sitting, wherever it lays, you're just resting it. You're not leaning into it, just resting it on you so that you have both your hands free. So we're just getting ready. We need that saw blade to be facing at us and with the teeth facing down, that when you run your finger up the saw blade, you kind of feel it catch your finger. That way we know the teeth are faced the right direction. So in a cartoon image of the saw frame, if I was going to draw this blade magnified, this is what it would look like. So there's the saw frame. The flat side of the blade would go in like this, and the teeth would be facing out and down. So like the side profile of a tree. Okay? So the teeth would be facing out towards the frame because you're going to cut away from you. You're going to hold the frame here and you're going to cut away from you. So I'm going to move this. I'm going to put that blade back in my left hand. I'm going to put the saw frame back in the bench pin and rest the handle against me. I'm going to grab hold of the blade again and make sure that it is facing, teeth are facing towards me, and that I'm running my finger up, but it's snagging my finger. Make sure all of your thumb screws on your frame, all three of them are loose. You only have to do this for the first time around. Then after that, after you have it set in place, you don't have to loosen the back one unless you're tightening it in a different way. So, which I will explain in a minute. So the first thing you want to do is put the top of that saw blade into the very top of the frame there. And a couple things that could go wrong when you start to really get into sawing and you get this down. Sometimes broken bits get trapped in there when you start breaking saw blades. So if that happens and your blade keeps popping out of the frame, you could check that area, make sure there's no broken bit in there in the top or bottom. Tighten that with your right hand. Then you want to make sure. So now we're going to tighten the back here, and this is always the first time around when you just first sit down to start sawing, or if it's a frame that you've never used before, or if you're in a community studio space. Usually they get kind of like changed depending on people's strengths or whatever happens if they break their blade and they're moving this up and down. So anyway, you want to then make sure that the saw blade is falling about halfway down this area, and then tighten the back. You're not tightening it in the saw blade in the frame yet. You're just getting it to a position so that when I go to put pressure on the frame, I'm going to get the right amount of tension because I'm going to push that saw blade all the way to the back of the frame there. So right about there, midway. Depending on what kind of frame you have, if you have a really short frame, it's not going to take as much, like, you're not going to be able to put as much pressure on the frame to get that blade to move. So you might feel like that's not enough, like that's not down far enough. If you have a really old frame, it might have a lot of flexibility to it. So you might not actually need to move this up a little bit higher and really put pressure into it. So that's always a situational scenario. This is a brand new saw frame, so it's got like the right amount of tension. It has only been used one other time, so it's gonna look a little different depending on what kind of frame you have. All right, and next you're gonna make sure that you put the frame back into the bench pin, the top part. Rest that in there so the thumb screws above the on top, resting on top, and then you're going to put your back hand, or your left hand, sorry, not your back hand, your left hand on the back of the handle, right on the back there, and you're going to lean upwards and then press as hard as you can with your left side of your body, like your hand on the back of the frame, pressing it into the bench pin so that that saw blade reaches the back of the frame right there. And you're gonna, while you're doing that, you're gonna tighten that thumb screw so that you get perfect tension on that blade. So that when you look at the saw blade and you press on it, like this, it doesn't move. You don't want it to look like there's a tightrope walker walking across this and it's bending. You want it to look completely stiff so it doesn't move at all. To the point where if I flicked it, I can hear a pinging sound. If you see this bend at all, it's going to snap almost immediately when you go to saw. So you don't want to see any kind of flexibility to that blade. It needs to be super tight in there. Really good tension. And I think that's about it. I'll show one other quick way if you're having trouble with pushing. If you're having trouble with pushing and getting the tension this way, you can also put the blade in, loosen these all. This is another way that people do it. Loosen the bottom, the back, scoot this bottom, the back part, all the way so that that saw blade reaches the bottom there. Tighten, and then come around here, put the back of that saw frame in your palm, put your 4 fingers, or 3 fingers really, inside the frame there and give it a squeeze. I don't love this method because I find it a bit painful. Hold on. So it's holding the saw frame like this and squeezing it and then tightening it. I find that a little too painful for me. Others might like it, especially because this is so long. And doing this and pressing into my palm hurts. I'd prefer to just press and put pressure like that and get that blade in there. So, but if you're having trouble doing that, this is another method. You can loosen that, tighten, and give it a squeeze and tighten. All right, those are 2 different ways that you can tighten a blade in a saw frame, or loading the saw frame. Thank you.